Hi, Cassie. I
Hi,
am so
Allie.
excited to ask you about exclusive pumping because you know a whole lot more about it than I do, and I'm trying to write this article. And you're an IBCLC and you teach our pumping class. So I thought you might be able to really enlighten us about this topic, which it comes up a lot. I imagine it comes up a lot for you. I hear about it a lot more these days. And so it's an important one. So first of all, can you explain what exclusive pumping is? What does that mean? How is it different from all other kinds of pumping?
Yeah, so exclusive pumping would be if we were not directly breastfeeding for any particular reason, and we would just be pumping exclusively. So that means that we're still offering breast milk to our baby, but it's coming from a delivery of just pumping and not direct breastfeeding at all.
Okay. And since you said that, so you collect the milk with the pump, and then how do you give it to your baby? Like, I mean, everybody probably thinks just it's a bottle. But is that the only option?
Yeah, so that does tend to be the most common option is to give it through a bottle. Some people do like to go straight to a sippy cup, even or you know, but bottle feeding I do think is the most common or traditional way.
Okay. And so, what are the reasons that someone would need to or choose to do exclusive pumping?
Yeah, I think there's so many variables and so many different reasons that somebody might choose to exclusively pump. Some of the big ones that come to mind for me are going to be just personal preference. If there is a reason that you do not feel comfortable directly breastfeeding, but you still have a strong desire to give your baby breast milk, you might choose to exclusively pump. So it could be personal preference. It could be that we attempted to breastfeed, but for some reason or another, maybe that would be just anatomical reasons from either the parent or the baby. There was just a disconnect for some reason. But again, that strong desire to offer breast milk was still there, then you might exclusively pump. Or maybe you have like a work schedule where you're traveling, or I mean, there's such a wide variety of reasons that somebody would um, choose to exclusively pump.
And of course, you know, we would recommend that people first visit with a lactation consultant like Cassie to kind of do any kind of troubleshooting, especially if you want to do direct breastfeeding and haven't been able to make it work. Maybe it's painful, or maybe the baby's not latching on well, or whatever the reason, to see if there's a fix for that before choosing to move on to this option, right? Because often you can help people.
Yeah, exactly. So if there is a reason that, like, I think if you're going into this with a conscious mind of like, I am choosing to exclusively pump because I want to, I think that's one thing. But if you are just concerned that you might not be able to breastfeed because you're worried about something, but maybe haven't been assessed by a lactation consultant, but you really wanted to direct breastfeed, you just have some fears surrounding it, then I think absolutely I would check in with an LC first.
Okay, that's good. And so then let's say it's at some point, if it's a preference, if it's something that you know ahead of time before your baby's born that you'll want to do this, that you know you're not going to be doing any direct breastfeeding, how would you start? Like from birth, like what would be the best way to be successful at this? Because I know sometimes it's hard, and sometimes it doesn't work all that well to be able to do this. So what would be your ideas for getting started?
Yeah, my number one first recommendation is going to be some sort of milk removal within that first hour after birth would be ideal. So typically I recommend some hand expression at that time. So right after the baby's born, I would encourage getting in there with your hand and just trying to hand express some of that colostrum. And then we would encourage initiating pumping in addition to hand expression as soon as possible, and then continuing to pump every 3 hours for 15 to 20 minutes in addition to some hand expression. We really rely on the pump to provide the body with stimulation that it needs to get those hormones moving, to just kind of alert the system of like, hey, baby's on the outside now. So the pump is going to be, the stimulation, whereas the hand expression piece is going to be the collection piece. Colostrum is thick and sticky, and it's often really high up in the breast. And so sometimes we have to utilize hand expression as a way to get that thick, colostrum out of the breast. It's normal to pump in the first 24 hours and not get anything at all. And so again, we want to pump for stimulation, but hand expression for collection.
Okay. I've also heard that you lose a lot of those drops in the pump parts and just
Yes,
on the inside of the bottle that's collecting the milk. And so you don't get to actually give as much of it to the baby because there's such a small amount.
exactly. Exactly. And so when we're in an environment where, we're pumping in that first 24 hours or hand expressing, we would even have you hand express either into like a little medicine cup. A spoon is perfect. And then we would pull it up with an oral syringe and then give it to the baby that way so that none of those drops get lost. But you're so right that the pump we often lose those precious drops. Yeah.
Okay. So, so that's how to get started while you have colostrum. But then at some point, the colostrum is replaced with a bigger supply of milk, right? And so then what? And then it's more like what it will be as you continue with breastfeeding or with pumping. So what would you recommend as far as like, do you get on a schedule? How do you do this? How do you maintain it once you have that milk supply?
Yeah, great question. So usually what I encourage is to really stay consistent with pumping at least every 3 hours for that 15 to 20 minutes. And then just kind of, putting yourself on a schedule. That is not what we recommend for babies that are directly breastfeeding. So it might feel counter intuitive to what you've heard before about breastfeeding. But with pumping, we do want to stay a little bit more regimented, just mostly as a way to protect milk supply over time.
Okay. So you're doing that direct breastfeeding. Exclusive pumping every 3 hours or so. And then you collect it. And then do you store it? Do you just give it straight to your baby? Like how do you kind of manage that as you move forward?
Yeah, so during the colostrum phase, everything, of course, would be going to the baby. But as the body's starting to make this larger volume, sometimes we can just build a little bit of a reserve. So anything that we're pumping, you can usually either put straight into the refrigerator or the freezer and store it that way. If you're pumping more than your baby needs, this is how we're going to build a little bit of a supply or a stash, if you will. Is anything that you pump, you're going to give some of that to your baby, and then the extra we're just going to add to the freezer. And so it kind of depends on how much is already in your freezer, because we always want to use the oldest milk first. And so I think it really just kind of depends on how much milk we're pumping. Everyone's body is so vastly different from one another. Some people are what I call a just enough pumper, which means they pump just enough for that next feeding, whereas other people have a little bit more of that reserve that we can kind of start putting in the freezer. So I think it really depends on what milk supply looks like. This would be another important reason to check in with a lactation consultant so you can really get an individualized care plan.
Yeah, definitely. Because what works for one might not work for someone else, but a lactation consultant can help you figure that out. That's great. So, and then, so you've got the milk, you're feeding the milk to your baby. How do you know how much? I just realized that's something that I would wonder, right? How do you know how much to give your baby?
Yeah, so breastfed kiddos will tend to eat anywhere from 2 to 4 ounces total per feeding throughout the entire first year. And that would still be the same even if we're exclusively breastfeeding, because your breast milk is constantly changing to be specific to what your baby needs. And so because the composition is what's always changing, we don't necessarily need to increase the volume. Whereas I think culturally we have gotten used to increasing the volume because there have been a couple generations where the majority of us were formula fed, right? And so we have gotten used to this idea of like, oh, my baby's 6 months, so they need this, larger amount of milk. But that's just not true for breastfed babies. Formula is the same from day one until that kiddo's weaned from the bottle. That formula is never going to change, right? So that's why we need to increase the volume for them. But for breastfed kiddos, we don't necessarily need to do that. That 2 to 4 ounces total per feeding is perfect.
Okay. And so, how do you know if your baby needs 2 or 4? Like, are you, watching the baby for, if they're hungry, if they're full, how would you know?
Yeah, I would encourage definitely utilizing some paced bottle feeding while you're feeding the baby, and start small and then just kind of observe the baby's, patterns and just kind of what they're, if they have hunger cues. So the reason I mentioned paced bottle feeding is because if we take a bottle, let's say it's a 2-ounce bottle, and we just tip that bottle upside down and that milk just kind of pours into them, they might suck down that whole bottle in 2 to 3 minutes. Well, then they aren't allowing their body time to figure out if they're still hungry or if they're full, right? And so they're almost always going to think they're still hungry because the need for suckling or that comfort by suckling wasn't met. And also they don't allow enough time for their brain and their stomach to communicate to figure out if they're still hungry. So oftentimes if a baby sucks down a whole bottle in just a few minutes, they're still going to be rooting around, even if they weren't actually hungry. And so that's kind of how we start that process of like accidentally overfeeding. It's very easy to overfeed a bottle fed baby. So if we really utilize those paced bottle feeding methods, that's where we keep the bottle more parallel to the ground, and we let the baby get a good, 2, 3, 4 good suck swallow patterns, and then we kind of take it away. You're almost just going to completely tip that bottle downward in the baby's mouth. And when they start suckling again, then we can bring it more parallel again. But this is going to be following the baby's lead. And by doing that, the feed is going to take much longer, which is a good thing because, again, we're allowing their brain and their stomach to communicate to figure out that they have had enough. But if we start small, let's say we do 2 ounces and a paced feed, and that feed took, 15 to 20 minutes, but they're still seemingly hungry, it's always okay to go back and get more.
Okay. So start with a smaller amount and then feed slowly using the paced bottle feeding method, just like they would at the breast. And then
exactly
add more if they are still showing you they're hungry after all that. Okay, good. And I think that's all the questions I have for you. I didn't even know that you didn't have to increase the volume in the whole first year.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know. So yeah.
I think 24 to 30-ish ounces total in a 24-hour period is what a baby needs to grow and gain weight appropriately. So I think as long as we're hitting that's all they need.
And paying attention to your baby and what they're needing, right? What they're wanting. So that's perfect. Thank you so much, Cassie.